Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible Bits. We are in Genesis 5 today, and we don't have a whole lot for today's episode because Genesis 5 is, like I said in the last episode, just a genealogy. Now, that doesn't mean there's no importance in the genealogy, but many of the questions we would ask of this genealogy are way too deep, way too involved for a very short video. We need full Bible classes for this. And so I'd encourage you keep showing up Sunday morning to Bible class. We'll get to Genesis 5 eventually, and we'll deal with some of those questions there, but we certainly can't deal with them in the short amount of time today. Instead, I want to make only a couple small points with Genesis 5. I'm not going to read the whole thing because, one, there's a lot of names that I'd probably screw up, and if you want to hear that, you got to come listen to it in person. And two, because there's not a whole lot of importance on a lot of these verses that we're going to talk about today. But the first verses that I want to look at are the very beginning of Genesis 5. Starting in verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And by book, it doesn't actually mean book. Remember, back then the term book was very, very different. It didn't mean a book like you have in your hand, you buy from a store. Basically, it was just something written down. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. Those are the first two verses of Genesis 5. This is a restatement of what happened in Genesis 1. The question is why? Well, I think what's happening here is that God is reinforcing that man indeed was made in his image. The reason I think that reinforcement happens is because it's going to get very hard to see that image shortly. By the time we get to Noah's story, by the time we move on to Genesis 6 and see what's happening, it's very clear that mankind has gone off the rails. They've completely gone the wrong way, are completely corrupt to the point where God has to just start all over. That's hard to reconcile with being made in the image of God. But I don't think it's an accident that this chapter of Genesis starts with that statement, because what we see here is through the line of Seth, from Adam to Seth and then down to Noah, we have a ray of light in the darkness, if you will. That one strand of people who, even if every one of them is not necessarily holy, are keeping the holiness, the holy image of God alive in that transition. They're passing on that image of God down until we arrive at Noah. Now, Noah was considered one of the most righteous men to have ever lived. In fact, in Hebrews 11, that great chapter on faith and the heroes of the faith, Noah is counted among those great heroes. Noah was certainly someone who was after God's own heart and who bore that image of God out in his life. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every single person leading up to Noah was that way. Enoch, for instance, was probably very close with God. He was so close with God, in fact, that Scripture says God took him up. He didn't actually die. But there's no indication that, for instance, Methuselah, who ended up being the longest lived man in Scripture, there's no indication that Methuselah was also in that same vein. He certainly could have been, but he may not have been. We don't know. But whatever the situation with all of these folks from Adam to Noah, there is that thread of light kept going down. God didn't give up on mankind. It's easy to get to Noah's story and come to the conclusion that God failed. Oh, God messed up. He arrived at Noah and mankind had just gone so far away from his plans, he didn't know what to do. I think Genesis 5 refutes that. There's a line, a clear connecting line from Adam to Noah that seems to indicate God knew what he was doing. Seth's son Enosh is the one who, chapter 4 said, that's when men began to call on the name of the Lord. Then we get to Enoch a few generations later, who was so close to God that God took him up. And then finally we get to Noah, who is counted among some of the most righteous men to have ever lived. In fact, in Ezekiel, he would be counted alongside Daniel and Job as three of the most righteous men to have ever lived in the history of the earth. Now, again, that doesn't mean every single person on that list was perfect or anything of that matter. In fact, Noah wasn't perfect. We'll see that when we get to Noah's story. But the idea that God had somehow screwed up and everything was out of his control, I don't think that's what Scripture says. I think it's very clear God had his plan. He had his people still descending down from Adam. The second thing I want to look at is an almost ironic statement. Starting in verse 28 of Genesis chapter 5, we are looking at Lamech, who is the father of Noah. And this is, from what we can tell, not the same Lamech from Genesis 4, where they're presumably different Lamechs. Again, that's a question that needs to be dealt with in an actual Bible class. We can't deal with that today. But there's Lamech, the father of Noah, and it starts with him in verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and called his name Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. I bring that up because that's almost an ironic statement, isn't it? Noah certainly would not bring relief from their work. He would not bring relief from the painful toil of their hands. It would be Noah in his generation that would see the absolute destruction of everything man had worked towards. Now, does that mean that Lamech was wrong, that he was wishing that he was talking in vain? No, I don't think so. I think Lamech looked at his son and saw goodness, who saw hope. But that hope would not play out the way that Lamech planned for it to. Now, Lamech would die before the flood. He would never see that destruction. But certainly when Lamech was holding baby Noah in his hands, he was not thinking to himself, certainly this guy is going to see the destruction of our world. He was probably looking at Noah and thinking, maybe this will be the hope for mankind in the future. Now, that would be correct, but certainly not in the way that Lamech had planned it. I don't think Lamech was going to wish the flood happen on anyone. But I think there's a lesson in that there for us. Oftentimes when we look at our own lives, we look at our own plans, we set out and we say, I'm going to do this. This is how my future is going to look. This is my hope for the future. We sometimes even do that with our family members and even our children. We look at our children and say, this is the plans that I have for you, that I'm going to see for you in the future. But God's plans aren't always the same thing. Sometimes God has a different path, both for us and for those around us. Sometimes for our children, sometimes for those we love. We need to be prepared for that. Now, Lamech, of course, would die before he saw what all happened, and that he probably would be grateful for that. But I think if Lamech had lived through it, he would have understood that, in fact, God was doing what God needed to do. Mankind was going the wrong direction. It needed a correction. It needed a redirection of its course. That would come through Noah and his family. So in a way, mankind would find redemption in Noah. And in fact, later on in Peter would compare the flood of Noah to the baptism of the believer, comparing these two things. In the same way that Noah and his family were redeemed, so we now are redeemed through baptism. There was a redemption for mankind in Noah's story, but I don't think it was the way Lamech was hoping when he said these words, when he hoped that Noah would give rest to mankind and bring them relief from their work. We need to keep that in mind as we go forward in our lives, that our plans aren't always God's plans. Many times the way we see things working out are not the way that God sees things working out. But God's plans always end up for the better. It would be through Noah and then eventually down to Abraham, and then from Abraham down to David, and David down to so on until you arrive at Jesus, that true redemption would happen for mankind. God's plan wasn't interrupted. God wasn't surprised by mankind's wickedness. But his plans weren't exactly what mankind was looking for either. Now, of course, there's many more things we could talk about from this section of Scripture, things that we could dive off into hour-long conversations on if we really wanted to. Did all these people really live hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years? What does it mean when Enoch walked with God and was no more? Those are questions to ask, questions we certainly can tackle in a Bible class. We're not going to deal with those here. That's way too long. But I hope this leaves you with at least a little something from Genesis 5. The idea that God didn't make a mistake. He didn't screw up and finally arrive at Noah, throw up his hands and say, well, I guess I just don't have any other choice. God always had his thread running through mankind. From Adam all the way down to Noah, he was not off track. Mankind was off track, but God was never off track. That's what I'm going to leave you with today. I'll see you guys in the next video when we finally get to that story about Noah and the flood and all the crazy stuff that happens there. Until then, bye everybody.